Hello, my fellow true crime lovers, not haters. I'm Nicole Knight, welcoming you to Psychopathy Soup, where I make a meal for my family while telling you about the most interesting true crime stories in America. We'll talk about serial killers, spree killers, occult leaders, and more. Oftentimes, the perpetrators of these crimes have sent pictures, letters, questionnaires, or found some way to contribute to this show. So if you like true crime and you like food, go ahead and smash that like button. Psychopathy Soup.
My life has been filled with violence. The murder, it was especially heinous. It was atrocious.
Dear Nicole, please don't be alarmed.
When I asked him why, he said it was due to an overload of evil. There are dark places in my mind.
First with a hatchet, then with a butcher knife.
As you well know, I'm close to the needle.
He's laying on the floor in a pool of blood.
Psychopathy Soup.
It's Psychopathy Soup.
Spree killer Bobby Joe Long was born in Florida in October of 1953. His parents divorced when he was 2 years old, so he spent the majority of his childhood in Miami with his mother. Now, many sources imply that he and his mother had an unusual relationship. Now, he did sleep in the same bed as her until he was 13 years old, and he had a disdain towards the men that she would bring home. However, they lived in a one-bedroom apartment, and it's never stated explicitly whether or not there was any abuse in the home, or if so, what kind. According to his ex-wife, he absolutely hated his mother. And some people speculate that he developed an overall hatred towards women. And this is a sentiment that he expressed to me in April of 2013.
Anytime I have trusted anyone, especially females, I end up getting kicked in the teeth.
Bobby Joe suffered several head injuries throughout his childhood, and he was also born with an extra X chromosome, causing him to develop substantial female breasts. He eventually had a breast reduction surgery, removing 6 pounds of tissue from his chest. Even with that, he was so humiliated and ashamed about the scars that he would swim with his shirt on, and he would even keep his shirt on when he was intimate with his wife. Now, despite the inappropriate relationship with his mother and being bullied by his peers, he went on to lead a relatively typical life. He joined the military, married his high school sweetheart, Cindy Brown, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And by all accounts, he was a loving and caring husband and father. Now, shortly after the marriage, he was in a serious motorcycle accident. He spent several weeks in the hospital, and this is where his story takes a much darker turn. If you've ever been in, or are now, in a domestic violence relationship, abusive behaviors have a cycle and escalation. He had begun very slowly and subtly cutting down Cindy's self-esteem, making disparaging remarks. And then he escalated to kicking, punching, slapping, and beating on her. He then escalated to strangling and choking her. In a domestic violence relationship, if your partner starts strangling or choking you, this is often the final warning that they're going to kill you. One evening, after a particularly brutal beating, when Cindy had to take herself to the hospital to get stitches, Bobby Joe told her, "If you tell them what really happened, when you get home, I'll kill you." Thankfully, in 1980, Cindy would divorce Bob. However, prior to the divorce, when things were escalating at home, things were also escalating in his double life. He had begun raping and terrorizing women all over the Tampa Bay, Florida area. He had become known as the classified ad rapist. He would use this sort of ruse of being an interested buyer to gain access to the inside of the home at times when it was likely for the woman to be at home by herself. He said later that he had some kind of kit that would prevent him from ever being caught. It's estimated that during this time, he raped 50 women. In March of 1984, raping strangers would no longer be enough to satiate Bobby Joe's bloodlust.
Men get lost as the years unfurl. He crossed some line and he was too much in this world.
This is when his spree killing begun. Now, what separates a spree killer from a serial killer is a cooling off period. And Bobby Joe had murdered 10 women from the end of March to mid-November. And the increments of time between the murders were getting shorter and shorter. By the time most of the remains were found, they were nude, badly decomposed, had been dumped on the side of a roadway, and drug out into the woods. Several of Bobby Joe's victims were ladies of the night, who he would lure into his vehicle, take back to his apartment, where he would tie them up, rape them, and murder them. When disposing of their bodies, it appeared that he was deliberately displaying the remains in shocking and obscure ways. The majority of his victims were strangled, had their throats slit, or were bludgeoned. Bobby Joe's first victim that we know of, towards the end of March, was artist Ann Wick. Then, in May, he killed Noon Thai Long, who was found nude, face down, with her hands tied behind her back, And she had a rope around her neck with a 14-inch extension like a leash. Now, police had found a piece of fabric lying underneath her face that they guessed was probably used as a gag. And her legs were spread open, a distance of 5 feet apart from each other. Later on that same month, he took the life of Michelle Sims, who was also found nude. She was lying on her back and had her hands tied at the waist and a ligature around her neck. Her throat was slit and she had sustained multiple blunt force head traumas. Her body was at the scene for about 8 to 10 hours by the time that she was found. And Long would ultimately plead guilty to kidnapping, sexual battery, and murder in the first. Now, during the sentencing phase for the murder of Michelle Sims, the judge had found 4 aggravating circumstances. Bobby Joe had previous felony convictions, and the murder was committed in commission with a kidnapping. The murder was heinous, atrocious, and cruel. It was also cold, calculated, and premeditated. Now, those 4 aggravating circumstances far outweigh the 2 mitigating circumstances. That Bobby Joe was under extreme mental and emotional distress at the time, and his ability to understand the criminality of his conduct may have been substantially compromised. Around Memorial Day, he sexually assaulted Miss Linda Nuttall. And shortly after his execution, Linda and her husband, when they were addressing the press, they explained that during the rape they had a 1 and 4-year-old in the home, and they thought it may have been a minor glimpse of compassion that Bobby Joe allowed her to live due to the presence of the children. However, the next time that he shown any compassion would lead to his arrest. In June, Bobby Joe murdered Elizabeth Ludenbach. In September, Vicki Elliott. In October, he went on to take the life of Chanel Williams. I did find one source that said that during her autopsy there was a wound found on the back of her neck and that the cause of death was a gunshot wound. Later in October, he murdered Karen Disfriend, who had been struck on the forehead and strangled. And before the end of the month, he took the life of Kimberly Hobbs. So you can see that the rate at which he started committing these murders was rapidly speeding up. Now, on November 3rd, he kidnapped a 17-year-old girl, Lisa McVeigh. He held her captive and sexually assaulted her. And then just 3 days later, he took the life of Virginia Johnson, for which he would be tried and sentenced to death. Less than a week after that, he murdered Kim Swan. Now, I believe what pushed him to speed up the rate at which he was assaulting and killing was the fact that he knew that he was going to be caught very soon. You see, Lisa McVeigh would become the hero of this story. Lisa had a very hard life. She was abused from the time she was 2 until she was 17 years old. And from 14 to 17, her grandmother's boyfriend was raping her. Now, Lisa had decided that she was going to commit suicide, and she had written her own suicide letter. She was on her way home from work, riding her bicycle, and she was on her way prepared to take her own life. And this is when Bobby Joe pulled over, snatched her off of her bicycle, blindfolded her, and pulled her into the car. He took her back to his apartment where he held her captive and sexually assaulted her for 26 hours. Now, I've heard it said that when a spider touches its web, the universe moves. And I believe that this was one of those moments. From the moment Lisa had been taken, she was absorbing every single piece of information that she could. She was taking in the fabrics from inside the vehicle. She paid attention to the approximate time of day that he was using the ATM. She even counted the number of steps to the second floor of his apartment building. And once she was inside, she was leaving her fingerprints everywhere that she could. Lisa was also analyzing Bobby's personality. She realized that he was a lonely man and that he had this sort of hatred towards women. She started to manipulate him. She told him that she could be his secret girlfriend and no one would ever have to know how they had met. She had also told him that she was the sole caretaker of her father who was at home ill. She played on his sympathies, and thankfully it worked. Bobby Joe drove for about 5 minutes and dropped her off on the side of a road next to a tree that she still holds very dearly. While police were putting together the pieces that eventually may have led to Bobby Joe, Lisa was instrumental in leading them straight to him. November 17th, about 2 weeks after she had been kidnapped, the police were able to pick up Bobby Joe in a movie theater, arrest him, and Lisa was able to pick him out of a lineup. And during the interrogation, he had said that he had a pretty good idea that Lisa could see from under the blindfold. So he did have some idea that he may be caught. He quickly confessed to the murders. On July 25th of 1986, he was sentenced to 28 life sentences and to death. And now, Lisa McVeigh, known as Lisa Noland, works for the Florida Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. Now, while Bobby Joe had told me that he doesn't play the lab rat well, he would spend 33 years locked in a cage. Eventually, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant, ordering the execution, and finally allowing the victims' family members and survivors to close this dark chapter in their lives. Now, the state of Florida still has 303 inmates awaiting execution. Only about half of the United States actively uses the death penalty, and there are 5 methods: lethal injection, hanging, lethal gas, firing squad, and electrocution. And lethal injection is the primary method in all states except for one, which we'll talk about in another episode. Bobby Joe did choose lethal injection. Immediately following Bobby Joe's execution, when Lisa McVeigh was talking to the press, she said that if she could say anything to Bobby, she would thank him for kidnapping her instead of another 17-year-old girl. She also forgave him. She said, "Had I not forgiven you, I would have been in my own prison without walls." Bobby Joe didn't have any final words or an apology for the family members of the victims, nor for his survivors. His final meal was roast beef, bacon, French fries, and soda. Once he was given the lethal injection, he continued to breathe for another 12 minutes. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Psychopathy Soup. Nighty-night.
Hope you don't scare too easy.